Okay, let's begin. So the snow today seems to have led to a little bit of attrition, but that's okay. We're very lucky to have Professor Chuck Sable from Columbia Law School here today with us. And we're going to do today's session a little bit different in that we have given Professor Sable a free rein to speak for as long as he needs at the outset. And we're doing so both because of the, I think, the novelty of many of the ideas here about new organizational frameworks as they relate to the new economy and our central challenge of creating inclusive prosperity. And secondly, also because these are incredibly central to what we're doing here. So, Chuck, you have the floor.
Thank you. So it's a great pleasure to be here and two old and very dear friends. And I'll rein myself in the use of free rein. Both in the interest of discussion, and I'm sure because along the way I'll say things that provoke responses, and I don't want my friends to be sitting in consternation while I proceed. So what I want to do is very quickly just situate this in general the landscape in which we're all moving. I want to say what I think the learning economy is. I want to say why it's simultaneously self-limiting, or it poses barriers to its own expansion, and why even in doing that, it opens a distinctive set of possibilities for connecting itself, the learning economy, to the large parts of the economy in both the advanced and developing countries which are excluded from it as of now, and which may continue to be excluded from it if the kinds of possibilities to which I'm pointing, and probably many others like them, which I'm not imagining, are not put to their best social and political purpose. And I'm going to stop short of doing something that Roberto encouraged me, and rightly so, to do, which is speaking in some length about the conditions under which these possibilities, the political, social conditions under which these possibilities could be realized. And I do that both out of an unusual fit of modesty on my own part about my ability to say something about that, though I imagine if I weren't reining myself in, I might have a shot, but I don't want to overtax your credulity and your patience. But the fact that I'm not going to address those things doesn't mean that they are that anything that I'm saying before that suggests that there's an automatic mechanism by which possibilities turn into actualities. Okay, so now, so first, this particular cat is already out of the bag, and it's, I think, common knowledge in your discussions. The starting point here is a world where there are firms, advanced firms, dynamic firms, firms capable of learning in a sustainable way. And then there is a large chunk of the economy where firms are static meaning they're above subsistence, but there's no natural path of accumulation of skill, capacity, resources in general, which causes them, by which they can keep pace with and become attached to, amalgamated with the firms in the first sector. So there's a kind of dualism, and this dualism, which used to be thought of as a characteristic of developing economies, is now a characteristic of just all the economies we see. That is, with nuances, there's dualism in developing countries and dualism in our country, in our advanced countries. And in that sense, these are the problems are common, and at least at some relevant level of abstraction, the solutions, the possible solutions should be common as well. So I think that much is, unless I'm mistaken, I think that's the framework within, the very general framework within which we're all moving, and that's fine with me. That's where I stand as well. Now, let me say something. Let me give a definition of the or several overlapping complementary definitions of the knowledge economy. These are all versions of the same thing, but they're different aspects that have a common feature. And I want to say that the common feature of the knowledge economy is an economy in which the economic actors understand their practices, the way they organize firms and other activities, the way they deploy and develop technologies, the construction of markets as provisional, meaning that all of those things can and are likely to change, okay? And that this provisionality manifests itself in principally two different ways. This is at a very general level of abstraction, but you'll see in a minute that it will connect us to the reading, and from there to the questions that I put as the goals to be addressed in the talk. So first, one idea of provisionality is that supposing you know that your best idea of designing something is likely to be deficient, okay? You think, I can build something that will work, but it was likely to contain latent defects. And now I have a choice. I can either design what I'm designing so that it recovers as quickly as possible from the defects so that I don't see them unless there's a major catastrophe, or I can design things so that breakdowns are quickly visible, and that's in accord with the assumption of provisionality. I expect them to be there. I want to identify them before their catastrophic consequences are manifest. I design things so that they break quickly, so that they can be fixed quickly, so that I can understand the cause of why they broke, and I can remove that cause, and successively I can improve the design. So the idea of provisionality leads me to design institutions, organizations that are fragile in order to expose defects. The defects which have deep causes, the causes lead me to the correction of the original setup. That's one salient feature. That means whatever I do, I'm set on some course, and I know I haven't found the best way to pursue that course, and I don't want to protect myself with hedges that disguise from me the errors that I've made until it's very late. I want instead those errors to be visible quickly. So provisionality goes together with fragility. And one claim that I'll make is that a great deal of modern advanced organization, advanced economic organization, is deliberately fragile in view of this idea of provisionality to induce learning. That is, the goal is not to have things break. The goal is that fragility is a constant spur to learning. And that's a very salient feature of modern organizations. So we're going to see that by itself turns out to be a barrier to entry. Mastery of the disciplines required to catch these errors is itself a barrier to entry to the knowledge economy. That's the first idea of provisionality. The second idea of provisionality is if you want deeper or broader, maybe both. Supposing I assume that for any way I have of doing anything, there's another better way of doing the same thing that I can't imagine. Okay? Now, that isn't the way things used to be. The typical assumption was, of course, I don't know what I'm going to discover in the future, but I can expect that what I discover in the future will grow out of what I'm doing today. And so, you know, if I'm a big company, I have a giant laboratory with teams that are dedicated. This is actually how research used to be organized in all the advanced countries. I have teams that are each dedicated to a major line of technology associated with the products of the company. And I'm perfectly happy to maintain these laboratories over decades. Decades. Bell Labs, in case you know, it's like the transistor, the laser, you know, kind of, it was doing fundamental research. And the reason was everybody thought, we know what the trajectories of technological development are. Okay? Supposing, for whatever reason, knowledge becomes, the potential solutions to problems are so abundant, technical understanding proliferates so amply that solutions in one area suddenly become, could we assume that anything that I'm doing may potentially be addressable in a superior way by something that somebody is doing in adjacently or far afield. Okay? Now, the most obvious area where this emerges, and it's routine, is in the development of new materials. I'm sitting there, I'm making some part out of a certain material, and suddenly, out of nowhere, you know, another material appears which will allow me to make that part faster, bend it more, make it more robust against stretching and other stresses, make it more or less heat resistant, whatever. Suddenly, all the constraints associated with that part are redefined by the fact that it's made out of something else. And of course, because that part can do different things because of these new properties, everything to which the part is connected can potentially do different things. So, and of course, new materials is routine. Are you, any of you skiers? You don't have to jump up in jubilation. I'm nearsighted. I won't even see if you're sneering in disgust. If you're a skier, you're basically skiing on aerospace technology. All the materials in skis are transported over as soon as they're deployed in advanced aircraft. They're deployed on advanced ski edges. Okay, and that's a trivial, you know, that's just an example for this kind of purpose, to make it, you know, plastic. Okay, supposing we live in a world where everything is provisional in one of those two senses. It's provisional because we didn't exactly know how to design it, and we designed it to break, so we could learn how to make that thing better, or it's provisional because as of this moment, but only as of this moment, we think this is the best solution, but we expect in the next moment that there's a like one with all kinds of repercussions for how we do the thing we're doing and all the affine things, the things that are like it and connected to it. Okay? Let's call that world a learning economy. Okay, that's a world where if you're not prepared, supposing that is the world now, we're not imagining that people imagine this, we're imagining that is actually the world they face. And if you don't have institutions and modes of governance and ways of organizing and so on and so forth that are adequate to this provisionality, you obviously succumb to the competition of people who do, because the implication here is that if you take advantage of provisionality, you learn very rapidly. If you don't learn very rapidly, you're not part of the learning economy. Okay? So this seems, that's the situation. Now, want to argue that now here I want to switch. I want to come to conceptually a couple of large questions, and then I want to come to the particular governance mechanism that you were asked to read a little bit about in that paper. Let's say there are a bunch of skills that are required to master provisionality. Okay? And that you don't master provisionality once and for all. Okay? You can be good at responding to provisionality, but then there's another provisional thing happens, and the question is, are you still good at that, right? This is completely antithetic to the way economic development was approached in the earlier period, where there were two states of the world, pre-modern, developing, and modern. And once you were modern, you're modern all the way. You just can't stop being modern. You know, it's just, once you're doing it, that's how you are, and you don't stop being modern. Here, you're provisionally able to be provisional. And you have to keep learning to do this. And the people with whom you're partnering have to be sure of this. Now, let me put this in a way that illustrates the question of inclusion and exclusion, and will then get us to the governance mechanism. Another way to put this is a learning economy. If a learning economy is a provisional economy is an economy in which, by definition, you can only succeed by collaborating with strangers. Okay? Now, I know some of you might have a sociological background, and you'll be worried that I'm going to take a veer into the sociology. Don't worry. This is, I mean, you're going to be. It just follows as a matter of straightforward logic. If I say I don't know what technology will be most suited for the problem that I'm currently facing, or the problems that I will face, if I can't anticipate that, then I can't anticipate who will be the partner most endowed with the ability both to master that technology and cooperate with me. It can't be me, because by definition, this is, right? Otherwise, we wouldn't have the problem. If I naturally grew into the ability to do the different thing I need to do, it would be on my trajectory. So it's not me, it's somebody else, and it can't be a familiar partner, because then they would be part of the same trajectory. So by definition, having just said the modest amount that I've said, I already have a world in which I have to cooperate with strangers. Okay? Now, a cooperation with strangers to do things that neither party has done before that's an odd. Don't go home and say, I have a great idea. I'm going to invest the family savings in a collaboration with some stranger that I just met, and we both have a vague idea of what to do, but neither one of us can describe it. But oh, and let's mortgage the house too. There's something odd about saying that you're going to do that. Just stating it makes it sound preposterous. But if the description I gave you is right, then it's absolutely necessary. Okay? You can't live in the learning economy the way I've described it if you can't find some way of collaborating with strangers. And now there's an interesting problem here, because collaborating with strangers sets a limit on how how closed the advanced sector, the dynamic sector, can be relative to the backward sector. We can't, if I'm going to say I have to collaborate with strangers, I have to keep open the circle of people with whom I collaborate. There can always be somebody from somewhere, including from outside certainly from outside the circle of my immediate familiar collaborators, and maybe outside the circle of people that I was thinking of collaborating with, period, who turns out to be well suited for collaboration. So if in a world where I'm going to collaborate with strangers, I need, and where I can't assume, because this is a world of provisionality, I can't assume that once they're collaborating, they're always going to be good to collaborate with. I need a bunch of procedures for, first, continuing to verify that people can, in fact, collaborate under the new conditions. And second, I need provisions for finding out who of the people, of the strangers with whom I might collaborate, I should most want to collaborate, is most able to collaborate with me. Okay? So this is, so we have two things here. One, on the one side, the fact that we have a set of demanding disciplines. We're going to work together to do something that neither one of us has done before. I'm going to get to that governance mechanism in a minute. But just very generally, once we know that that's a task, we need a bunch of disciplines for making sure that we're making progress. Those disciplines it's hard to live up to them. Not everybody can do it. That's exclusionary. Okay, by definition, something that not everybody can do is exclusionary. It doesn't mean they can't learn to do it, or it just means that as of the moment that the task is defined, it's demanding relative to what many people can do, so it excludes. On the other hand, provisionality requires me also to anticipate that I'm going to need to include people not currently collaborating, and that I need a set of procedures for identifying them, qualifying them, and perhaps as well training them, helping them build the capacities necessary to collaborate with me. That is, supposing I find somebody who has most of the qualities I need, but not all the qualities, I might say, look, it's better that we invest jointly to build your capacities than that I continue to look for somebody who is perfect without any supplemental investment. Hmm? So, okay. All right. So we have, just to be clear, we have a definition, a spare definition of the learning economy as about provisionality in these two forms. And we have associated with that the idea of the necessity of collaborating with strangers, which is at once inclusionary and exclusionary. And let me be clear. I'm not claiming that mechanism is the only thing or the dominant thing that explains why you have big chunks of economies that are divided into these in different proportions in advanced and developing countries. The claim I'm making is the link between one of the continuing important barriers to entry is also potentially a bridge. So it's both a gate and a bridge. Okay, the same kinds of mechanisms that continue to exclude people once they've been sorted into these bins is also a mechanism for bridging the gap between them. Okay, is everybody with me? Just conceptually, then I want to say something about this actual mechanism, and then say how it might be. Just say a little bit about how it might be applied to addressing the question of actually bridging the gap between the sectors. Everybody? Okay, I'll take that as somewhere between assent and generous bafflement. So, weighted however you want to weight it. Okay, so I said before that this idea of collaborating with strangers to do things that neither party knows how to do is a very odd task. And if my characterization of the learning economy is right, it should be that people are doing this a lot and that they should have mechanisms for doing it. Okay? And they do. They are doing it a lot, and they do have mechanisms for doing it. And the mechanism, very generally, is the one that's set out in that paper. It's incredibly obvious. There's nothing, like, what else would you do except set up a regime where you stepwise, incrementally, each party obligates the other to produce information which shows whether they are both capable and willing to contribute to the further definition of the project and advancing progress toward it. And as each given a bunch of mechanisms for producing that kind of information, the parties either find out that they have capable partners in a feasible enterprise, or they find out the enterprise is infeasible, or that the partners are unapt, or some combination short of the desired outcome. But they find that out before there's a disaster, and if they find out that they have the right partner for a feasible or a suitable partner for a feasible task, previously all but unimaginable task, then the return to persisting with those partners is so great that it literally does not cross their mind to go and betray them by partnering with an alternative. So it's very important to see that this is a process where everything that you think is necessary to underpin an agreement is the consequence of working toward it, not the precondition. That is, these people don't share norms because they're strangers. They don't share a single economic interest other than in the good outcome, if there is a good outcome. But as they come to have an actual project, and it proves to be feasible, and they prove mutually reliable, they do, in the process of determining that, generate the norms that we think of as trust, and they generate the kinds of mutual reliance which we think of as the alignment of interests or incentive compatibility. Okay? So this counterintuitive, meaning our normal understanding of how an agreement is formed, how it comes to pass, is turned upside down. The preconditions are the outcome. But there is a mechanism like that, and there's a lot of it. There are examples in the paper from a bunch of different industries. Now the list of industries is much longer. But let me give you a very recent illustration, just so you get a sense of how pervasive this is. This just made an impression on me, largely because for my sins, I've off and on studied the American automobile industry, which is a troglodyte. You don't need me to tell you that. It's not an avatar of advanced production. It was in 1920 and again in 1955, but it's been a while since then. And from the late 70s, early 80s on, the American industry knew for a fact that it was using outmoded organizational technologies. That is, where the Japanese had switched to a version of the fragile technologies that I mentioned at the very outset, the Americans stuck with something else that basically hid all these defects. And there were contracting relations that mirrored this troglodyte view. Okay, so now we fast forward to the present after the financial crisis, where these companies go bankrupt, and they suddenly realize, oh, they're in a world where everything is unforeseeable, let's say uncertain, or let's say provisional in the language of this framing. And now we can't design everything ourselves. Before, we had to be in the situation we wanted our suppliers to compete to be, they had to compete with each other to be our best supplier. Now our suppliers, current and future, are likely to know more about the technologies that they're deploying than we do. So we have to compete with other large automobile companies to be the preferred buyer of the supplier, because we want the supplier to exercise their best efforts in innovation with us rather than the competition. So everything is turned upside down, the power relations and so on and so forth, okay? So we go and we look at the contracts in General Motors. Just to give you an idea of how much of this there is, so that we're not talking about things that are marginal here, and this is important to understanding how connected the advanced sector is with the rest of the economy. So just General Motors spends $70 billion a year buying stuff that goes into General Motors cars. A fraction of that goes to something called strategic supplier agreements. Here's how they work. This is just an illustration. I repeat, you can do this. If you can find this in the automobile industry, you can find it anywhere you look, under your bed, anywhere. It's less likely to be in the automobile industry than under your bed. Okay, so the contract says this. It says supplier will co-design the part. You and I will sit down and we're going to, based on our current experience with making this, we're going to co-design the next generation of the part. We're not going to give you a blueprint to execute. We're going to design it together. We're going to design it. After we design it, we're all grown-ups here. We all know what kinds of processes go into making a part like that. So this is round. So there's a machine tool that a lathe, let's say, that just is good at turning things into cylinders of different diameters. So we all know what it costs to run a lathe for the amount of time using the metal stock to produce something of this shape. So we can estimate a target cost. If you hit the target cost, we're not going to put this part out to bid. We're not going to ask who can beat this cost. We're just going to say that's the target cost. You produce the part. You produce the part during the life of the program, a particular vehicle model of a vehicle. And then when there's a next generation, we're going to ask you to co-design the next generation of the part. That's called a strategic supplier agreement. Okay? Now, let's just notice this for a second. This is a completely closed economy. If you have everybody working this way, you have a totally closed economy. You have an economy where there's no market, nobody ever goes out to bid on anything. The people who are inside until the end of time. Okay? So this exists. You want to know why this thing is closed? It's closed because, there are other mechanisms, but they're analogous to this, okay? So for purposes of presentation, assume this is the door. This is the door that gets slammed. Once you're inside, you're in, and, okay? Now, so we don't have to look far for elements of closure. Once you throw at everybody who can't do this, right? They have to co-design it. They have to, and I left out some steps. Like, by the way, after you've co-designed it, you have to reduce its price 10% a year for the life of the vehicle. By the way, after you've co-designed it and reducing its price, you've got to reduce its weight by 10%. Yeah. If you look at any aircraft, a kind of commercial aircraft, at the beginning of its life cycle, at the end of its life cycle, it's lost a third of its weight, and that's not a carb diet. That's actual engineering. And for those of you the many of you who wear Prada coats season after season, you'll discover that their weight has been reduced, is regularly reduced for the same thermal loft. Okay, so these are very, very demanding conditions. The door is closed. What percent of General Motors' $70 billion is spent this way? Troglodyte, 50%. And that's not counting, you know, fancy new batteries, autonomous vehicles. That's counting stuff that looks like this. It's more complicated than this, but it's this, okay? So there's real closure in this, but it can't be permanent closure. It can't be permanent closure for two reasons. One is, as that list of desiderata that I just gave you, you know, the sort of reduce the cost by 10%. By the way, reduce the cost by 10%, reduce the waste, the weight by a third over the life of the thing. Do all that, and do that without ever once producing a bad part, and do that without ever once delaying a delivery by more than an hour. If you do all of that, you'll be given a green, you know, it's like a traffic light rating. You'll get a green rating every month. You're rated every month. There's a discussion about what goes wrong. This is a very demanding system. Okay, so closed, but of course, every time there's a new development, it's open again. It's open again, because you don't know who can do it and who not, and whether this part is going to be a cylinder or a sphere, whether it's going to be made of magnesium or chalk, we just don't know. That's the provisionality. Okay. Now let me come to the question of how to make this more. I want people to understand what this works. It has a different form in developing countries. Just one sentence about that. In developing countries, it's less about co-design. It's more about joining supply chains where you start to, where you're part of the production system, but subject to the same kind of quality and reliability requirements. So you start at that and then you move up. But you're part of the same system. Once you're inside, you tend to be inside until you screw up. But screwing up is not hard to do, and not screwing up requires constant learning. Okay. Supposing there's another aspect. Supposing, I'm going to do this very generally, maybe too generally. Danny and I talked briefly about the difficulty of presenting some of the current stuff we're doing on industrial policy in the context of this kind of a presentation. But I'm going to try with small apologies in advance, just because I don't want to go on for too long, and it's a topic in itself. But I want to at least get the question on the table of how to extend. Supposing you had an economy that was dual in this way, that was divided between these two sectors, and we know there's a bridge, and we know there's a door, and now how do we think about expanding, moving the frontier? Okay. Now, the first thing to notice is that there's no natural barrier. It isn't like there's anything in this dual system which says it's important to the functioning of the advanced sector that all these other people be left out. Okay, there are a lot of theories about dualism, world systems theories and Marxist theories of different kinds that say you need the people to be left out because something about their exclusion is what's enabling whatever the achievements are in the. This isn't like that. This is worse. The only thing worse than exploitation is utter neglect and indifference. I mean, even in exploitation, there's a kind of a denatured human connection. This other is you're just not part of the world. You don't exist. And you can fend for yourself if you can develop an informal economy, good luck, but in conceptually, and I understand that the politics of this are utterly different, but just the basic fact is that nothing about the advanced sector depends on exclusion. In fact, there's no reason, if you could get more people to participate in these advanced practices, there'd be more innovation, there'd be more purchasing power, there'd be presumably a better, you know, to the extent that this is environmentally sustainable, there'd be a better environment. There's only good to be had from increasing participation in this. The problem is that it's very hard to do. Okay, it isn't that people, I think that's not a trivial point, that with respect to earlier periods where the good of some seemed to be really dependent on the misery of others, it was called immiseration. Here, the immiseration is just miserable. It doesn't even serve a purpose. It's just humanly horrible. Okay. Now I want to do, I'm just going to put these things up for discussion and see whether people want to hear more about that, but I'm just going to connect the two things to show you where the argument is going. So we discussed this governance mechanism from a narrow perspective. Okay, the governance mechanism is a way of linking strangers. It's an interesting mechanism because you may have heard the learning economy referred to as a network economy. That's another version of it, right? So if you have people linking up in the way that I described, they'll produce networks. The outcome of the linking will be a network. The crucial thing that's doing the connecting is this mechanism. That's why we're focusing on the mechanism, not the network. But you can think of this mechanism, so in one sense the mechanism establishes the productive structure, but it's doing something else. The mechanism is expanding the space of institutional possibilities. I said earlier, you know, it turns regular agreements on their head. The outcome, the output, the preconditions of the standard agreement or the output of the, you know, or the result of the operation, it's doing something else. It's going deeply beyond what we think of the principal-agent relation. Is that an idea for you guys? You've heard of that? No? Yes? Yes? Okay. So if you go through your education here and you haven't heard that, you know, point to the part in the where the guarantee says, you know, you owe me something here. So principal agent is that's really, it's a key instrument, and it's thought to be the thing that structures political relations and the relation between the people, the legislature to the administration. It's the structuring principle of hierarchies and so on. And here there's a mechanism by which when neither side knows exactly what to be done, there can't be a principle in the traditional sense. Okay, so that's what's unusual about this. Now, this is a mechanism for figuring out how to build solutions when you don't know the solution in advance. And the first general claim I want to make, and this is something that Danny and I are developing, and it's topic for another separate discussion. But if you want to think about how to design an industrial policy, supposing you said, okay, I understand that there are these two sectors. They can be linked because there are these potential connections. There's this inevitable openness and a lot of potential linkage. But I don't know, figuring out what kinds of help has to be given to each set of firms so that they can take part in the supply chain to which they're connected, they can meet these disciplines. That's really demanding. No central actor can do that. How could we get the state, but of course private actors are not going to want to do that because they won't get the full return, right? In other words, if I help some firm to get into supply chains, maybe it'll be only in my supply chain, maybe it'll be somebody else's supply chain. No private, their first choice is to look for people, even strangers, sort through them and find a partner and then run this process and get a partner. They'll only invest in qualifying people if they start to run out of people or somebody else bears some of the cost of that. Okay, so you might think, okay, that's a kind of externality. Society would gain a lot if they made those investments, but the firms are not, it's not in their interest to do it. That wedge between the social return and the private return is an externality, and that's a classic case of where you want a government policy. But then the question would be, are you kidding? How could you have a government policy that could figure out how to intervene to build up the skills that are necessary for these firms to work with those firms under these very demanding conditions, which are changing all the time? Okay? That's the problem. It's easy to, just very generally, it's very easy to figure out a way to do, to speak about this. But what I'm going to claim we're pretty much able to do is to show you how these new governance mechanisms actually do allow you to, in the same way that they allow you to design a thing that you've never seen before, they allow you to design institutions that can meet the demands of these kinds of matching processes. They can, this is only one of the examples of what would be needed to address the question of expanding the boundaries of the frontiers of the advanced sector. But it's just as a way of illustrating the structure of the argument. That's the idea. So in very rapid synthesis, an economy of provisionality, where the same things that close it open it, where the same governance mechanism that allows for the solution of the local problem of connection and generates a network and so on, it enriches the set of possibilities for addressing relations between solving externality problems and addressing relations between private and public actors in a way that plausibly can help make the kinds of public investments and the public mobilization that can expand the sector, the frontiers of the advanced sector when the narrow economic interests of the firms in that sector are not sufficient. So that's just it's a view into a way of thinking about this. It's not a full solution, but hopefully it's enough to get a discussion going. Thank you.
Can I, that was great. So I'm going to ask you to take all of this to a specific example, which I know that you've thought about it. And I think sort of all these different elements that you've talked about in the abstract can actually be brought maybe a little bit more into life. So think about the whole sort of the Apple supply chain. It has many of the elements from the outside of the knowledge economy in terms of obviously at the very frontier of technology, those sort of, the whole elements of provisionality, very much there. It has, on the face of it again, some elements of the old economy in terms of, sort of simple, basic production. Think about the Foxconn, it seems to have provided the kind of a traditional marriage on the one hand of a kind of a knowledge economy component. Apple developing the R&D and the design, and then you have developing country essentially providing the production workers, providing sort of good jobs in China. In fact, such good jobs that even Wisconsin wants to have those jobs in the United States. And then and Foxconn and Apple have this kind of supply chain relationships with the kind of contracting that has presumably many of the elements that you've described, but you can tell us a little bit more about that. And then Wisconsin, the state of Wisconsin trying to apply some version of an industrial policy, which is to try to bring these jobs into the US. So essentially, enlarge in some sense the scope of this, good jobs or the more sort of advanced manufacturing sectors employment in the United States by essentially employing a strategy of tax incentives. We'll give you these tax incentives, this land, such these easement and that easement, and in return for you Foxconn coming and building a plant in the state of Wisconsin. That's kind of a traditional industrial policy. And so I want you to reflect on this whole story from the standpoint of where does the knowledge economy and old economy meet? Where are the boundaries? And number one. Second, how has this been changing? Because obviously Foxconn is changing. What does that mean in terms of the ability to marry sort of large-scale employment with the knowledge economy? And third, you finished up with some ideas about this new kind of industrial policy. How does that contrast with the sort of the state of Wisconsin's industrial policy, which was, we'll just give them some tax incentives, invite them here, and to create some jobs, and it's something that actually has blown up because it turns out that Foxconn is not willing to create those jobs. So the whole thing has essentially blown up, which I think it sort of relates to what is it that we're trying to do this. I don't know. Might this be a good example to bring?
Well, it's a good example to illustrate old and new industrial policies and a kind of a fundamental shift in what's going on with the development of supply chains. So Foxconn is a little unusual in that assembly of these parts is iPhones and things is very unusual because all the complexity is in the components. So the actual putting together of an iPhone is just snapping things together. And it's extremely simple, and people learn the job in 15 minutes. I mean, really, they learn the job in 15 minutes. And if you do it for 2 months, you don't learn anything more. It's very unusual, and you can't automate it because the phone changes every year. So it's extremely, even compared to a garment factory, it's a very unusual, but there are millions of these jobs.
So that's the old economy,
that's
production,
the old economy.
mass production.
Exactly.
Although it is a massive sort of the hinterland of the knowledge economy in some ways.
It's on the other side of the border. It's exactly the hinterland of the knowledge economy, and that's kind of if you wanted to say the knowledge economy contracts out, this is an example of that. But it's a very unusual example because there are almost no other cases where you can do this, where there's that kind of a break between the knowledge economy and Foxconn contributes. Foxconn has a lot of different capabilities. So when I say Foxconn, I mean the part of Foxconn that's assembling these things. But that part of Foxconn contributes almost nothing to the way Apple designs. It doesn't do anything. Apple engineers are in the factory actually running most of it. The robotics, to the extent that there are robotics, are Apple robotics, and they're for test stations. So it's an example of exactly the kind of separation between the knowledge economy and outside that I claim is no longer typical. Okay, that's one. Two, it's nonetheless fascinating that the state of Wisconsin would go after these kind of jobs because they were packaged as jobs that you could buy off the shelf. You know, they were packaged exactly as, look, how many would you like? What color? You know, it's sort of, do you want the family pack? And they even said this is quite, they even specified in the original agreement that it would be, these plants have generations. It was basically a flat screen plant, TVs, and it would be a generation 10.5 plant, which is a relatively advanced, and Foxconn then realized Wisconsin doesn't have the skills to run a generation 10.5 plant, and there are other problems. So they backed out of the agreement entirely. And so it's a good example, and Wisconsin had no other industrial policy but buying the jobs. Okay, so it's a good example of what industrial policy, how a stunted idea of what the knowledge economy is, combined with a very limited idea of what industrial policy can do, produces a bunch of stuff which nowadays just doesn't work. So in that sense, it's a good negative example. It's the complete opposite. Now, when there are plenty of examples, though because I do know about the Apple supply chain, I can't talk about Apple. Apple is quite willing to go and work with small capital goods producers in China or in other countries to go figure out how to solve very complicated processing problems. And the reason that they want to locate a lot of this stuff in China is because that's where those processors are. And not because it's cheap labor, they just have more. And the Chinese municipalities provide lots and lots of the services that we would think of as the natural complements to this. There was a very good little piece in the New York Times about Apple's failure to do manufacturing in Texas. And the problem turned out to be that in order to do manufacturing, especially of things that are screwed together, you need screws. Okay? So what's happened in the United States is that anybody who mass produces screws has gone overseas. So the only people left in the United States who can produce screws are people who basically produce screws for surgical implements, or sort of extremely complicated screws. And if somebody says we need 50,000 of these kind of screws, their price structure is, it's as though you're asking for 50,000 prosthetic devices, not 50,000 screws. So you have a missing ecology in the United States. So, and that's the kind of thing. That's exactly the kind of thing. It's not, these things are not, they're hard to do for individuals. They're not hard to do for communities and collectivities. That is, people learn quickly, and if you decide you want to set up, if you want a proof of this, you go to South Carolina. Improbable place. I'm not recommending this as a place for your political edification. But if you go to South Carolina, you'll find some of the biggest, most capable German automobile plants in the world making precision equipment, and they trained a huge number of American technicians and people to run these automated lines. So they built a modern ecology very deliberately.
Initially attracted by low wages and low taxes.
Yeah, absolutely.
So sometimes it works.
Well, that's the point. But by itself, that's the difference. Wisconsin, that's all they offered. In South Carolina, they offered a combination. So in both cases, that is, South Carolina is a case of a successful industrial policy where they used low taxes and low wages to start a process. And Henan province, where one of the largest Foxconn plants is now in dire trouble, is a place in China where they pursued the Wisconsin strategy. So, in other words, they just said, okay, we're going to give people low wages and that will take care of it. And they didn't do this other stuff. So these things don't match up with, you don't get the countries always having consistent policies or provinces or whatever the relevant unit is.
So you're saying you need to marry some of these tax or wage advantages with an institutional structure that supplies a whole bunch of public inputs or complementary inputs,
Right.
Which may take the form of training. What else?
Well, training, research, because you're constantly running up against technical limits where the ability to improve the process depends on trying new things. The boundary, when I portrayed this goes directly to the question of what kind of services. When I portrayed this, I said, look, there's one form of provisionality is making things fragile, and another form is unpredictability of technological trajectory. But of course, in reality, one feeds into the other. I start to look at why something is broken, and I discover the limit to the technology I'm using. So I want local institutions where I can start to look into these things. This kind of advanced problem solving it can't be contained within the firm. So between skill formation, technical formation, managerial skill, because you need, the firms have to be able to manage these relations. That's a lot of additional complementary inputs. It's not just low wages.
Chuck, I wanted to press you more on the process of expansion of this knowledge economy. So at the outset, you said that you would stop one step short of discussing the conditions. But I wanted to get us one step closer to the discussion of conditions by putting to you the problem of the process. So one simple view of the expansion of the knowledge economy, which I know you reject, is a view that is sometimes propounded in the business school literature, that there's a certain kind of firm, sometimes called a disruptive firm, and that the expansion consists in multiplying the number of these good firms. Now, right at the outset, you've gotten us beyond that by focusing not on the isolated firm and its distinctive attributes, but on a certain process of collaboration. It is, however, a process of collaboration among firms. And then at the end, you suggested that there will be circumstances in which the firms themselves and their process of collaboration are not sufficient to get to the next stage of expansion. And then the government has to do it. But you implied, I thought, that the process by which the government would work to overcome those limits would be in some significant sense analogous to the process by which the firms overcome them. And that would then be, as it were, an intermediate step between what you could call horizontal expansion, multiplying the number of good firms, and a vertical process in which you change the framework. Could you tell us more about that and how you envisage the process by which the state solves this problem, and in part solves it by developing for its own purposes this open-ended practice of collaboration?
Okay. So let me do this in steps, because this is at the heart of this stuff that Danny are doing in the conversation that
Yes.
we've been having. So we're friends. Feel free to to add and correct them. But let me start with the part of your characterization with which actually I agree with all of it, but where I just want to underscore the first step of the argument. Once you say that this process isn't going to be a process of, there's not a natural growth path by which the accumulation of the advanced firms leads to expansion of the sector, but that that's deeply suboptimal, to use an awkward word for it, as it's politically unacceptable and it's economically suboptimal, socially suboptimal, then the government gets involved. Now, a first step is to demonstrate that that what the government does and what the firms do will be mutually intelligible. That is, supposing we continue with this idea of provisionality, and we say it would be impossible to think firms can't know what they're going to be doing. Their organizational setup is provisional. Their technological choice is provisional, but the government can know what exactly to do. The government can have blueprints even though the firms can't. So we have to start with the idea that the government is going to be in the same situation of provisionality with respect to responding to all of this, fully accepting the idea that the end of the provisional changes will be a dramatic vertical transformation on the vertical dimension, okay? An extension of institutional possibility. But we can't have goose and gander are in the same situation, and if the firms are marked by provisionality, so is the government. If that's true, then we have to have some assurance that there's a governance mechanism available to the government, which is it can speak uncertainty in the same way that firms can speak uncertainty. Okay, that there's a basis for collaborative exploration of what this transformation of the institutional relations will, cumulatively radical transformation of what these, incremental but cumulatively radical transformation of these institutions will be, okay? So the first step in this argument, the place where I stopped, was to say, look, this mechanism that described the collaboration among firms is also available as the lingua franca for this joint exploration under conditions of provisionality and uncertainty of the transformation of institutional possibilities. And then in the paper that we're doing, we actually give examples of that from a number of different realms to show how this works. But that's the structure. You asked, I think, an excellent question focused on the structure of the argument. That's the structure of the argument. Then beyond that, there's a whole set of questions about how do you imagine, me, you, all of us, how do we imagine that transformation? What does it look like, its contours, its trajectory, and so on? And we can start down that road. But that was the point that I made, that's where I wanted to focus attention. If we're agreed there, then we can start to go further.
And the basic complementarity between the firms and the government is rooted in the dependence of the firms on a variety of public inputs that the state can provide.
Right. Only the state.
Only the state can provide, and the dependence of the state on the knowledge economy or its expansion being fundamental to the attainment of social and economic objectives for which the firms themselves don't necessarily particularly care of.
That's the externality.
And that's the rationale for the partnership. But what you're saying is it has to be a partnership that cannot be based on the sort of the principal agent model, where we presume that the state has a pretty good idea of what it wants to achieve.
It cannot be based on the administrative equivalent to Fordist mass production.
Exactly.
Which would be what you could call administrative Fordism, which is by default still the dominant practice of administration in the world.
But
That's
so
the
let me
problem.
just make, on this point, this is a crucial point, because in a lot of the discussion, the more standard discussion of industrial policy, this point is finessed by saying what you need is a consensus, you know, a kind of an elite consensus, or, you know, a national consensus. And then with that consensus, I'm just going to use terms that appear in this other debate, the national consensus. So even, I think in the background there is some idea of administrative Fordism, but there's a national consensus. The national consensus allows the state, you know, for embedded autonomy, because then there's enough state authority based on the consensus and the institutions.
They're complementary because the consensus is then implemented through the administrative
State.
Fordism.
Yeah, right. So that's the standard view, and this is a counter view.
In which the very first threshold problem legally is that the state cannot, if the state is to operate by a form of organized experimentation, which is the administrative reinvention of this practice among firms, the state cannot operate solely or chiefly through the form of universalistic rules.
Exactly.
Which are adopted all at once or not at all, which is at the very heart of the received conception of the rule of law.
Okay, so let's, in this paper that we're doing, we use, there are examples inside the current administrative state where this universalism is deliberately disavowed. So one of them is in environmental legislation, because the kind of a classic example is the EU Water Framework Directive, the objective of which is to produce good water, meaning no listed chemical pollutants and biological conditions which don't deviate from, this is the key point, pristine conditions in the various different types of water bodies that exist in Europe. So the point is, there's no universal thing called good water. There's good alpine streams, good Mediterranean rivers, good Baltic brackish, and for each one, there's a kind of deliberative discussion about what's a distinct type, and then what counts as a pristine example, and then calibration given that. So the analogy we draw, and there are a bunch of mechanisms for contextualizing general rules in the view of, so it's exactly the problem you're pointing to. That's one workaround. There's another source that we don't talk about, but you're starting to see a breakdown of this within the administrative state. So another example is in welfare. So welfare is going in two directions. One direction is abolish it. To hell with vulnerable people. And the other direction is contextualize it. Welfare doesn't mean everybody has to get a particularized bundle of services and particularized to their particular family conditions. So the question of, like, are you general eligibility doesn't mean anything. What matters is the conditions you're in, and the general right. Your general right is to have an administration that responds to your particular circumstances. So I agree completely. The administrative state is based on this universalism. We're suggesting you can't apply it. It doesn't work at all in industrial policy. And the argument would be there are substantial examples within current administrative law where administrative Fordism is being disapplied.
Shall we open it up? Could you speak loudly?
I wanted to understand in a little bit more depth the reasons for emerging of dual economy, in which one is the knowledge economy, one is the old economy. I thought that the arguments you gave were more sort of failure of politics and sort of implicit dominance by the needs of the people who are left behind. But I'm just trying to figure out if there are gains to be had. Is there some sort of failure in rationality or failure in capacity of why people are not able to collaborate within that older section of the economy and sort of reap the gains of learning? That I think is the basic point of knowledge economy.
Why isn't everybody in the knowledge economy?
If the only differentiating factor is that they're able to learn faster.
Well, specifically, just to follow up on that point, in your argument, you emphasize almost exclusively a certain practice of collaboration, which in principle, in the way you describe it, doesn't depend, for example, on particular educational requirements. So that's the question that he poses of if this is the key that opens the door to engagement in the knowledge economy, why isn't everyone in it? It's not a secret, it seems, to learn this practice as you described it.
So there are two. Let me break this into.
Can I answer this while you think about it? Because there was one answer that we asked a version of, this is really just, so I don't want to preempt what you're going to say, but the same question was asked in a somewhat different form last week in the context of Ricardo Hausmann. So as you know, sort of his way of putting some of the things that you've said is in terms of these different letters of the alphabet, and sort of these collaborations are these letters, and the knowledge economy depends on putting all these letters together, and the failure occurs when you have individual letters stuck on their own, and the absence of the other letters that are indexed. So, and the question, and the answer as to why do you get this failure, and the failure is it's a massive coordination failures. If all the letters could be brought together, they would all be collectively very productive. If you can create all these collaborations and have all these networks, they will all be part of the knowledge economy. But these ecosystems don't arise, or what in an alternative version, what you would call these ecosystems, that of sustained collaborations with sort of these sort of thick labor markets of people and knowledge and skills within an area that provides this pool on which these collaborations can draw. If you don't have them, it's very difficult to get them started on an incremental basis. Once you have them, they are relatively self-sustaining. So the answer from the Hausmann discussion was that this was really a kind of a coordination problem, and the reason that industrial policy of the type we're talking about solves it is precisely because it provides a number of these public inputs that invite some of these collaborations, then can make them to be. So that's one answer to this, and that also justifies at the same time the kind of industrial policy that we were talking about before. So that was my long parenthesis.
No, but that's helpful, because I want to distinguish an answer from that. So let me break your question into two pieces. One is why doesn't this problem solve? Why don't private actors? If the answer is right there, collaboration pays. Why don't? And people are not, they're not degenerate. They understand that. Why don't they just do it and join in with this? And the second question is if they don't do that, why don't public institutions and politics solve the problem that they can, okay, or don't. And so let me answer those, and they will be clear why, though there's an overlap with the coordination view, this is a little different. So first, this is important. This collaboration is very hard and it's very risky when you're starting. So just imagine this to be very concrete. Imagine you grow potatoes in the Peruvian mountains, and you've done this. Your family has done this for time immemorial. And now people, these are before they were just potatoes, and now they're native potatoes, and everybody wants to eat them. And there are fancy Peruvian chefs that come, and they think your potatoes are wonderful, and so on and so forth. And so you grow these potatoes, and now you go to a buyer, and the buyer says, these are great, 30% of them are substandard. Now you can have two reactions to this. One is, I have been doing this in my family for 1,000 years, go to hell. I know what, and besides, I can walk down the street and I can sell these for 10% off, and this, good luck to you, sir. And that's completely, it's not a crazy response, and you'll be able to subsist, and you may be able to send your kids to school, but you don't want to take the risk of learning to increase your quality, and above all, you don't want to be in the position of having to deliver regularly because you have a life where you do a lot of other things, and the regularity required for supply. So it would be very demanding. So you face an actual choice between, the choice is not extinction, the choice is subsistence with some possibility of accumulation, or accepting a bunch of complex disciplines with risk in order to progress. Okay? So, and it's not clear, there's not a rational choice. Not clear what the rational actor does in that situation. It depends on whether you're accumulating for your family right now, or what, it depends on all kinds of things. The point here is, it's not obvious that the thing to do is to say, oh yes, thank goodness you've told me that I have these rotten potatoes. Whatever you tell me, I'll do. That's not the obvious answer. So it's not clear that rationally people want to connect with this thing, even though they see the advantages of connection were it to occur. There's a big risk, and it's very disruptive, and it may compete with other accumulation strategies. It often does. So a lot of actors in this range who are, so this is not a question, they're excluded in the sense that there are these very demanding requirements. No one is inviting them in, but they're not excluded in this. It would be perverse to call them self-excluding, but they're making a choice, and the choice could well be to do something which perpetuates or increases the growth of the informal sector, because now there are more cheap potatoes available for people at low wages and so on, and the productivity of potato growing doesn't go up, and the quality, and so on and so forth, okay? So that's a reason why we could get a lot of sustainable dualism under rational conditions without there being an unbridgeable gap. But all of the reasons that I just gave for this person's hesitation are things that could be addressed through public programs. If somebody said, look, I can help you with a loan to reduce your risk if you try this new crop and it doesn't work, I can help you learn these techniques. Here's a way of knowing before you go to market whether you're making quality or not. This is so you're not. Here's a way of adjudicating disputes so that you're not at the mercy of the merchant, and so on and so on. There's a lot of institutions that can reduce the risk and make it much more rational. So the government is not producing the linkage. The government is producing the conditions under which the linkage is much more likely to occur. Or it doesn't even have to be a linkage from that point of view. It could be other things that wind up producing a connection. I can give lots of examples, but Now, so that's the first part of the first part of your answer. This is not just a problem of complementarities. That's the point here, because the letters, let's say some letters are faded from the point of view of, if we're thinking about, letters being combined to be legible, some letters are less than legible, and those are the faded ones, and we need to build their capacity for visibility. Okay, so it isn't just coordination. It's just not just knowing where the letters are and connecting them to form words. It's actually changing a feature of the letter, and that's the difference with Ricardo, and that's where. So now, then there's the question about why doesn't why don't politicians do? Why doesn't the state do this? And that's a really good question. That's a really good question. Let me stick with Peru, in part because Danny and I have a very good Peruvian friend who mentioned, we were talking a little bit about today, and a bunch of my thinking about this in the informal sector is influenced by things we're doing together in Peru. Peru's a country where there was a leftist, well, I mean, it's hard to know, sort of a leftist, I don't know how to characterize Fujimori, sort of an advanced murderous leftist populist thug, but with a developmental twist. Sort of, it's hard to.
Sounds like Napoleon Bonaparte.
Yeah. without the Code Civil, there was no, without the universal part. But the reason I mentioned Fujimori is that his base was in these very, exactly these kind of people who were, I was just talking about, these potato growers and others, and not only them, but, and he passed a bunch of laws that were meant to benefit them in various ways. Not one went to these questions of helping them improve their production and provide services. And it's an interesting question. He wasn't, believe me, this was not moral compunction. He had none. It wasn't that he wasn't prepared to seek their support. He would do anything. It's a real mystery why nobody, Now I think some of this has to do with the theme dear to Roberto's heart and mine too, institutional imagination. I think that there was the idea of founding a mass movement, a mass mobilization on this kind of capillary learning. The only people who really did that were the very best things of Maoism had to do with collective learning, with people learning to read on the march by reading characters on the backs of the people in front of them, and people learning together. There were flashes in Maoism, let's not get carried away, flashes in Maoism of mobilization for collective learning. And you could imagine, and of course during the New Deal, there was a great deal of this in the United States. So this is not alien to human experience. It's not, and it may be closer to being on the agenda than we imagine, but it's just a fact that your question, sort of, once we agree that it's easy to think of private reasons for not doing this, rational reasons for not doing this, why a prudent actor wouldn't say, what else would I do? That's the wrong, that once you get past that, then the question has to be, why is it not on the public agenda? And the answer to that was always a very shallow one, which was, what? The state can't do X, Y, and Z, cut welfare checks. How could you imagine the state doing this highly contextualized, a version of the point that Roberto made a minute ago? So once you say, well, wait, we actually can imagine the state doing that, the state is doing lots of that, that doesn't solve the problem, it's no longer a show-stopping argument. And that's where I think we are now.
you want to take your own questions?
Yeah, please.
So that's the imagination argument for building capacity in the state, right? But even if the state can imagine it, then the next step becomes, especially in I'm not familiar with the Peruvian context, but in India, for example, it's well thought that the government doesn't really have the capacity to do innovative things with the private sector, and in general, that state capacity is pretty like not strong. And so I'm trying to imagine, even if we now enable everyone to imagine this glorious future, what concrete steps you could take to actually build state capacity to move it in that direction.
And if I can put a somewhat different twist on the same question, could it be that there are ways in which this different conception of what the state does actually economizes on capacity, or that doesn't necessarily increase the burden on the state, but because you're starting, for example, that the state doesn't start with a clear view of what it is that it's trying to achieve. In other words, that's all in some sense up for grabs. So.
Yeah, the circular aspect of the problem is that you can characterize the task as learning to acquire capabilities that you do not yet have, which would sound like a solution. But you have to have the capability to be able to learn to acquire capabilities. That's the circular aspect that comes back to the issue of state capacity.
Which might still be easier than
Yes.
having it from the get-go.
Maybe, or maybe not.
Okay. Yeah, but what I'm suggesting, it might be
Because the universalism could be a radical economy on this kind of capacity of assent.
Yes, okay, but, well, this is, let me come back to your question in 1 second, but let's, to connect these things. That universalism was conceived of as conserving. It was, that was the whole point, was you have one rule, and, okay, so
one rule, you apply it to everybody, and therefore
right.
it's still presumed that you could enforce it, which is where the capacity issues arose.
In the same way that was thought that institutions can serve on virtue. Can serve on virtue.
Yeah,
on
yeah.
political virtue.
So there were a set of arguments, and then those arguments were redoubled with more recently with sort of neoliberalism is about saying if you want to have these don't pollute the capacity conserving features of these universal rules by doing X and Y. And so we need a very clear barrier, and the interesting fact is that that's just gone. It doesn't work. That is, it isn't like you can have this discussion in the abstract and say, can you imagine a world where the universal solution would be the most economic one? You can. It's just not the world we live in. People have tried this and it doesn't work, and that's why you're getting all of these things. And that's why it's very interesting that the private firms, they don't use this either. That is, they're not going to universal contracts. They're going to these relations where they're constant. Okay, so now that said, I think this question of capacity to learn capacities and whether there's an infinite regress or not, I think that the whole point of this of collaborating under uncertainty is that the capacity to build capacities is co-produced. I think that that's actually one of the radical things about this, is that the idea of that is not that you go out and discover people that already have exactly the capacity that you didn't know you needed until you turn out to need it, but that you go out and discover people with whom you can co-create their own capacity and your own. So you don't know in advance whether they have the capacity to co-create, but it's not about, it isn't about a prior fixed thing. It's about something which is created in the effort itself.
So this is when you say preconditions are the outcome.
Are the outcome.
Rather than, so you don't take capacity is a precondition for it, but capacity is built as part of the outcome. But sort of not seeing quite how that gets you out of the infinite regress, because you still have to select people on the basis of their ability to produce that capacity as an
And
outcome.
not only that, Danny, but the standard objection in many of these contexts is that as you begin to go up this ladder of capacities, you risk falling into the abyss of cronyism and corruption, the avoidance of which was the first justification
universalism.
of administrative universalism.
Well, so here, and I don't want to lose this question about India, to which the answer is Gujarat. I'll come back to that in a second. But these, just on the cronyism question, then on the question of this infinite regress. So on the cronyism question, the point here is these are arrangements are subject, they're incredibly searching. They leave an extremely public record. That is, you're getting rated every month in a way that involves, I mean, the conspiracy would have to be massive. It can't be just one or two friends. It has to be everybody who deals with this plant or this subcontractor. They're designed, actually, a lot of these systems, from that point of view, were designed in order to break down the cronyism of the old supplier-buyer relations. Because so the first thing that they did, the very crude thing that they did, this is embarrassing, was they put all the buyers into one open room so they could hear each other over on the phone. And that was a very modest step forward. And then eventually, 15 or 20 years later, they got to the point of these things where the ratings are produced by all. So
There's still a residual problem of good faith.
Well,
because otherwise you can manipulate these procedures and retrospectively justify them in this vocabulary.
So I love this where you're playing his part.
yeah, exactly,
And-
exactly.
and
He's suddenly
my
good
sort of
friend is
worried
suddenly
about
turned-
corruption and cronyism.
No.
I'm just trying to unpack his
No.
argument.
This is he's suddenly playing exactly the Harvard Law professor that he spent a
Exactly.
career
Yes.
attacking.
No.
Yes, yes.
And I'm unpacking your
And the
argument to
neoclassical
Gujarat.
economist.
Yeah. Well, it's good that you've learned something from your encounters. So, let's leave the infinite regress question hanging, because I think we both have too easy an answer. One is the pragmatist answer is there's no foundation. Okay, that's where this comes from, and that's a standard view, which is that there isn't a bit of foundational knowledge on which to stand. You start somewhere and you build and construct, and even the reason you're going through these selection mechanisms is because you can make a mistake. So you do the best you can, but you need the selection mechanisms because you don't trust yourself, either from the point of view of probity. There might be explicit or involuntary cronyism, and you truly don't know if the other person has the capacity because you don't know whether your own capacity. So there is an initial selection problem, but the whole mechanism is set up to quickly identify mismatches and to go on to the next. And the flip side of that is when there is a match, if you thought it was easy to identify people, then it would be easy to switch. It would be easy to ditch a partner because you could find a substitute. If you think it's really hard and that's the result of a process, then switching costs should be super high, and that's what you see. So I take that as evidence for the fact that the people who are watching it think of this as a co-created in that sense. Now, let me just say something about I'm only half kidding about Gujarat. Gujarat's an interesting And it's not because I think Mr. Modi is, sort of like what politicians should be, but there is an interesting. There's not a lot of industry. There's a reason that India has not developed industry as much as services, and there are all kinds of very interesting questions about that. But Gujarat is a place where it has developed in motors, things related to auto parts and so on. And I think I had your question. I don't know much about India, but if I wanted to think about this, I would go to. I mean, the service parts are relatively straightforward, but I would look to see how industrialization has occurred. Just not because industrialization is the sole. You could pick agriculture, some agricultural areas as well, where India is doing. There are some subsectors where it's doing very well, and I would just go and see how it happened. I mean, the idea of thinking about India as a whole is even less plausible than we were talking about Wisconsin. There's huge, I mean, unbelievable variation. So I think the question is not, what is India apt or not apt? The question is, where in India is there positive variation that you can use to start a question, start reflection and debate about these problems of institutional imagination? Other?
Yeah, right.
On industrial policy, it seems quite complicated. So I have two related questions for clarification. First, there is old industrial policy and a new industrial policy. So I was wondering what's the major boundary between them?
The major?
Boundary. Second, I'm not sure if I got it right, which is you think both old industrial policy and a new industrial policy could not be effective. Am I right? And why?
No, I mean not on the second part. I mean everything cannot be effective. There's nothing you can do that's always effective. Or let me put it another way, there's nothing that can't be subverted in one way or another in practice and will not be. So nothing works. There are no panaceas. So,
on conditions.
Was that?
Yeah, there are some conditions.
Yeah. Well, even but I mean that's a kind of debater's point. I just the one I just made is a debater's point. But so on the difference between old and new is that the old industrial policy basically assumed that there was people in a sufficiently high position had a workable view of what the economy was supposed to become, either comprehensively what sectors it needed or with respect to important things that could be done in the short term that would manifestly have good spillover effects for the economy, and that if you put resources, if you could agree to either inducing investment in that or encouraging domestic investment, there would be very large returns, and it would require social consultation to achieve that, and the elite consensus was the precondition necessary and sufficient for that, or almost sufficient. So that was the old industrial policy. And there were all kinds of limits and so on, but the basic idea was the economy was not thought of as uncertain. It was thought of as having a visible shape, and the question was marshaling the political will to make the investments that private actors discreetly would not manage to coordinate. That's the old. The new is the economy is not foreseeable in that way, except within the ground against the backdrop of the kinds of considerations. That is, we know what the requirements are to participate in the dynamic economy, but we don't know which or what sector and so on and so forth. And second, that the problems for connecting firms outside the dynamic sector to inside the dynamic sector, or making them able to participate in the dynamic sector, don't have to do with just a missing resource, something that can be supplied by a government, by finance, or by building one school. They require an ensemble of measures that you can only articulate through the kinds of institutions that we were just talking about. So that's the difference between old and new. And no, so I believe that old worked in a certain time period under certain conditions. I don't think it was an illusion. It, like everything else, it didn't work all the time, but there were enough examples of it working so that, I mean, I don't know whether all things considered it worked enough to justify the total amount invested in it, who knows? But it certainly worked in some dramatic ways some of the time. It doesn't work anymore, and the only thing that seems to hold promise of working is something like this new kind of thing, and for the reasons that we were just talking about. That is, the private actors won't do it themselves. Public actors should and can.
So it's a continuation of what we've described as the dilemma of development, and that conventional industrialization no longer works as the shortcut to economic growth. The old industrial policy is just another side of conventional industrialization.
Right.
And the other thing, which is the inclusive form of the knowledge economy, seems to be inaccessible. And so in a way, the brunt of your argument is that it's not necessarily inaccessible, that there is a way to make it accessible. But that argument devolves, it seems, into two parts. One part is the process of expansion about which you spoke, and the other part is the conditions for the radicalization of the process of expansion about which you chose not to speak.
Yes. Not that I want to be mute about that forever, but you pick your battles.
But just to be clear, when you discussed the reasons that the advanced sectors, the knowledge economy, remains insular and disconnected from large parts of the rest, you did not put any premium on the skill requirements in the way that sort of economists think about skill and training in the new economy, because because you view those skills and learning as much a product of the collaboration, as much in fact, and not as a precondition of belonging in the new economy. So I mean, I just wanted to just be explicit about that, and just maybe as a last word, just ask you to say something about sort of skills and training as a precondition of being part of the new economy, and therefore to what extent absence of skills and training is a reason for this dualism.
Yeah, so I think that's an important point, and definitely underexposed in what I was saying. So the standard, let's call it Nordic view, is that if you create a lot of skills, then it's a version of what I described before with the supplier, the change in the relation of the supplier and the purchaser. So the old relation was that the suppliers competed to be the preferred supplier, and now the purchasers compete to be. So the argument would be something like this. If you have a knowledge economy based on provisionality, then of course you need very skilled people, because skill is the ability to adjust to new circumstances. If you have a lot of skilled people, then buyers of skill will compete to have the most skilled people so that they can meet provisionality in this way. And so the supply of skill should be a determinant in the extent, right? And at the limit, what you would say is, if you can get people sufficiently skilled, then firms will acquire additional capacities to participate in the dynamic sector so that they can hire the skilled people, right? So that would be the, and I.
But there's an ambiguity, right? Because Danny was pressing you on technical skill, and you were speaking about cooperative skill.
Well,
and they're connected.
They're
but they're not
connected.
the same
They're
thing.
connected. They're connected. But let's say there's, I was silent about both. I mean, you're right. So it's both of those things. Now, but it's the organizational part is crucial because you can't. One way to think about this, and here I'm going to connect this back to the kind of argument I was making. This is an important, kind of extension of it that you're suggesting. So you could think, look, we know what the skills are. Let's just build the skills, and it will be like a baffle, and then people will, they'll just, the directionality will be changed as they have to accommodate the baffles. But the other way to think about it is, well, the reason they need skill is because they don't know what's going to happen, so they don't know exactly what skill, so you need some right? And then you're exactly back in the land of these institutions again. So I think, and we should probably do this in the paper, we should build in that argument in this way.
Great. Well, fantastic. Thank you. Thank you very much for taking our discussion to a level of institutional detail that we did not have previously. So I think we've really moved further. We really appreciate it. Thank you.